The Poet and the King. The sun was setting over the loch as the poet approached the hall of the king. A long earthen ramp led him up past the towering stone walls and into the heart of the ringfort. The king's men saw his cloak of birdskins and feathers, its many colours shimmering in the last gasp of the daylight, and they stood back respectfully. The feast for Samhain had already begun. The fires burned brightly, staving off the encroaching winter cold for one more night. The cattle had been gathered in from their summer pastures and could be heard adding their low voices to the rising tide of laughter and singing coming from their masters and mistresses, seated around the fire. The stranger approached the king without fear, bowed a little, and said, "My name is Forgoll. I heard you were in need of a poet." "You heard right," replied Mongán, the king of the Dal Nara. "You have good timing, my friend, for we lost our Fili only a week ago." "I know," said Forgoll. Bardon, the queen, shivered at the grim certainty of his tone, but said nothing. There was something in the man's expression, in the way his eyes slid across his audience as if calculating their value, that made her uneasy. But Mongán was delighted to have a solution to their missing poet walk himself in out of the cold. To test Forgoll's credentials, he asked him to tell the story of Fionn mac Cúil and how he gained supernatural wisdom from the salmon of knowledge. Forgoll launched into his story straight away, painting a vivid picture of the flowing waters of the Boyne River, the poet Finegas leaving young Fionn to cook a huge salmon for him but ordering him not to eat it, the boy Fionn spotting a blister on the fish, popping it with his thumb and then quickly sucking his thumb to numb the pain of the inevitable burn, and the despair of Finegas when he returned and realised that Fionn had tasted the magic salmon and all its knowledge would now be his. Throughout the tale Mongán nodded along, smiling and laughing. When it was done, he stood up and applauded. "Well told, Forgoll," he said. "You must stay and serve us here as our Fili. You shall be paid handsomely in both silver and food." And so Forgoll stayed, and entertained Mongán and his people every night all throughout the long winter, as the snows came and went across the drumlins, as spring flowers bloomed on the feast day of St. Bridget, as the rain turned warm and the clouds a lighter shade of grey, and finally as the bonfires of Beltane were lit, he was still there every night telling stories. Bridin avoided his company whenever possible, for she could not help but think that he looked at her in the same way he looked at the cows, but Mongán enjoyed his company, and his supply of stories seemed to be endless. But on a warm, unusually sunny evening in early summer, it all went horribly wrong. Forgoll had been telling a few more stories of the great hero from the pagan days, Fionn mac Cúil, and his band of warriors, the Fianna. The night before, they had all heard of how Fionn's friend and foster son, Carter mac Ronald, had helped to bring about the disastrous marriage between Fionn and the Princess Grainne. For Grainne did not like Fionn, and set him an impossible task to complete before she would marry him. He must collect 2 of every wild animal in Ireland and drive them all together to the hill of Tara. But Caillte was so swift-footed he was able to complete the task and demanded that Grainne marry Fionn, a union which made her so utterly miserable that it could only end in their separation and divorce. Mongán had been impressed with Forgoll's sensitive rendition of the story and decided he would like to hear another story featuring Fionn and Caillte that night. So he asked Forgoll to explain how one of the ancient High Kings of Ireland, hUidre, had died. Forgoll spun a pretty tale of blood and vengeance and death, but Mongán found it less pleasing than Forgoll's other stories had been, and the details were all wrong. "You tell the tale well," he said to Forgoll when he had finished, "but it was Cainne who was killed down south in Lagan, not hUidre." A chilled silence fell across the hall. Forgoll rose to his feet and a shadow fell across his eyes. His whole person seemed to change. He stood taller and loomed larger, his hands held in balled fists by his sides, his feather cloak flung out across the floor around him. "You dare to contradict me," hissed Forgoll through clenched teeth. "You are wrong," said Mongán simply. "Take that back," cried Forgoll. "Take it back, or I will satirize and curse you. I will curse your father and your mother and your grandfather. I will curse your waters so that fish will not be taken in their river mouths. I will cast a spell upon your trees so that they will not bear fruit, and on your fields that they will be barren for all time." Mongán sighed deeply. "I cannot allow you to dishonour me, my father, my mother, or my grandfather," he said. "But neither can I simply agree to a false truth. I suggest a wager." "What will you wager?" demanded Forgoll. "If you have not conceded that I have the right of it by the end of 3 days," said Mongán, "I offer you 7 kumals, which you may take as 21 milk cows or 21 ounces of silver, whichever you prefer." "Not enough," said Forgoll, "for my honour is at stake here too." 14 kumals, said Mongán. "Not enough," said Forgoll. 21 kumals, and you may take them as slave women or milk cows, said Mongán. But it was still not enough for Forgoll. 1/3 of Mongán's land was not enough, nor half, nor even all the land and all Mongán's people except for himself and Bardon. A sly smile came across Forgoll's face. "I will take that offer," he said, "but only if the beautiful Bardon is included as well. You alone may go free, your honour intact, and I will not satirize you or your father or your mother or your grandfather." Bardon expected Mongán to refuse and to point out what an exceedingly generous offer he had made already, but to her horror he merely nodded his head. "Agreed," he said. "If I have not provided evidence to support my claim by the end of 3 days, you shall have it all." Bardon felt as if her stomach had dropped out of her body and her breath was constricted. As she stood up to leave the hall, Forgoll raked over her body with his eyes, and as she was forced to pass between him and the fire, he allowed his arm to fall away from his cloak and brush up against her thigh. She looked to Mongán for help, but to her horror, he appeared to be absent-mindedly chewing on his thumb. A weak sun rose through a hazy sky the next morning, and Bardon stood on the ramparts of the ringfort, gazing out across the rolling hills towards the distant mountains. She wondered if she should simply flee in the night. She did not know where she would go or what she would do, but at least she would be free and out of Forgoll's grasp. A single tear rolled down her cheek as Mongán climbed up behind her. "Why are you crying?" he asked, drawing her close to him and wrapping his arms around her. "Do you really need to ask me that?" said Bardon. "You know how much I dislike Forgoll. I have told you many times since Samhain that just being in the same room as him makes my flesh crawl. I still cannot understand why you like the man so much. And now you have promised to hand me over to him while you go free." "I have done no such thing," said Mongán. Taking Bardon by the shoulders, he turned her towards him and looked into her eyes. "I would never have made him that offer," he told her solemnly, "if the thought had even crossed my mind that I might have to keep to it." "But you have promised it to him," cried Bardon. "You promised on your honour to give him me, your land, and everyone else in 3 days." "I did not," said Mongán. "I made a wager. If I provide evidence that supports my claim in 3 days, he forfeits it all. And help is coming. The man who will prove my case is on his way here even now, washing his feet in the Lebor River as he runs towards us." Bardon fell silent and returned her gaze to the hills, keeping watch for any sign of someone coming to help them. The following day she returned to that spot as soon as the sun rose, looking out over the stone ramparts, searching the countryside for anyone who might approach the fort. But she saw nothing. "The man who is coming to help us is still running, my love," said Mongán. "It is a long way. Today he washes his feet in Loch Lane." By evening, Mongán assured her the mysterious helper was fording the River Suir in Munster. By the next morning he was washing his feet in the River Berber, and by midday on the 3rd day in the Boyne. "He will come too late," said Bardon, tears flowing fast now. "Nonsense," said Mongán. Evening fell on the 3rd day. Bardon remained in her place on the ramparts, peering out into the gloom, straining her eyes in a desperate attempt to pick out a man coming towards them, but there was no one there. Forgoll climbed up the steps laid into the wall and approached her. "The sun sets," he said, "and it is the 3rd day. You are mine." "Stop!" cried Mongán from below. "The sun may have set, but we are not yet at the end of the day." "Stop wasting my time," said Forgoll. "Pack up your things, woman. This may all be mine now, but I no longer wish to stay in this fortress. We are going." But Bardon was not listening to him. "Look," she said, pointing out into the growing darkness. In the twilight they could just about see a man approaching. He wore a thick cloak folded around him and carried a large spear shaft, which every few steps he used to propel himself forwards. A joyous smile spread across Mongán's face, and the tension in his body fled. "Come to the hall, both of you," he said, "and we can settle this there. We have a guest." "Welcome, friend," said Mongán to the newcomer, and they embraced like old companions and walked together towards the fire. The two moved with the ease of family or of brothers-in-arms who have long seen service together. The newcomer was clearly a warrior, for although his face was lined with age and he leaned a little on his spear shaft, his build and his strength suggested he had been a formidable fighter in his younger days. "You have a beautiful hall and a strong ringfort," said the man approvingly. "I have heard," he added with a wink, "that the great loch out there was created when Fionn MacCool hurled a great chunk of the land at a Scottish giant, though he missed and merely created an island in the middle of the sea instead." "You hear a lot about Fionn," said Mongán with a smile. "Some of it is true." Bardon and Forgoll followed them into the hall. Forgoll was quietly fuming, his hands once more clenched into fists and his face locked into a scowl. Regine was roughly wiping her face, trying to scrub off the tears, but without much success, for they just kept falling. "What's going on here?" asked the stranger, watching them. "What's wrong?" "This Fili and I have made a wager," said Mongán. "He claims that the old High King, hUidre, died in Duvor in Lagan. I have told him that is false. Now he demands all my lands and all my people, including my wife Bradine, or he will satirize and curse me, my father, my mother, and my grandfather." The warrior tightened his grip upon his spear shaft and turned to the poet. "You are wrong, Fili," he said. "Who are you to contradict me?" demanded Forgoll, advancing to stand behind Bradine and looming over her. "You are just some washed-up old warrior, living out your days in a monastery in the middle of nowhere, reliving your past glories." At this the stranger laughed long and heartily. "I am no monk, I can assure you," he said, "and I know that you are wrong about Faha's death because I was there. Fiona and I both saw it with our own eyes." As he said this, he nodded knowingly towards Mongán. But Mongán, to Bradine's surprise, snapped at him angrily. "Hush!" he hissed at his friend. "That is not the issue here." "Very well," said the warrior without malice. "I was there then, with Fionn MacCool and the rest of the Fianna." "Now I know you are talking nonsense," said the poet smugly, "for Fionn was already dead by the time hUidre was killed. The whole Fianna was almost gone, except for Caillte mac Ronan and Fionn's son Oisin." "That is not so," said the warrior. "You need to check your sources, so-called poet. We had been in the north of Britain chasing giants in the parts the southern Romans could not reach, and we were returning home by the Alaba River. We encountered hUidre, who, like you, thought most of us were dead, and was convinced we were a threat to his kingdom. We fought a great battle on the banks of the Alaba. I took the spearhead from this very shaft," and here he held out his great spear shaft and twirled it around in the firelight for all to see, "and I threw it at him. I hit my target. It went right through his body and plunged into the earth, where it remains to this day." "It is a good story," acknowledged Forgoll, "but if this were true, you would be hundreds of years old." "Or perhaps I have been reborn," said the warrior, glancing at Mongán and winking once again, but with his head turned so that only Bradine saw it. "Anyway, I can prove that what I say is true," the warrior continued. "The iron spearhead that killed the High King still lies where I left it in the earth by the Alaba, just a little to the west of hUidre's tomb. He lies in a stone coffin deep in the earth, and the silver that gave him his name is all with him, 2 silver rings, 2 silver armbands, and his silver necktalk. They all lie on his stone casket, and next to the tomb is a standing stone. There is an inscription, too, in the old letters that reads, 'This is the tomb of hUidre. Caillte mac Ronan killed him when he went to battle against Fionn MacCool.'" Bradine reached out in wonder to the warrior, and even dared to touch the edge of his cloak. He turned to her and smiled, and for a moment his face and features seemed to shift and change a little, becoming younger and fiercer. He had given them no name, for it seemed that it was his old name he wanted them to know him by. Caillte mac Ronan. "These are just fine words, not proof, and it is the end of the 3rd day," grumbled Forgoll, but without much conviction. "You must extend the time limit to allow us to travel to the tomb and show you our proof," said Mongán. "To refuse would be extremely dishonourable." Forgoll could not argue, for he knew it was true. At dawn the next morning he set out with them to the tomb of hUidre, where they found everything exactly as their visitor had told them they would. Bradine ran her hand over the sharp lines of the Ogham lettering, wishing she could read it. It was strange to see something in her language, but written in a form she could not decipher. On seeing the stone and the inscription, and digging up the spearhead from the ground, Forgoll the poet stood up, swept his feather cloak around him, and rode away without a word. "I suppose we need a new filly now," said Mongán ruefully. He turned to the warrior and thanked him for his help, offering him rich rewards of silver or milk cows. "I need no reward, father," said the warrior quietly, and he embraced Mongán tightly, whispering in his ear so only Mongán and Bradine standing close by could hear, "It was good to see you." Mongán said nothing, but stifled a tear as he watched the old but young man walk away, still using his spear shaft to leap swiftly across the hills far faster than any normal man could. Bradine opened her mouth to ask a question, but Mongán scowled and shook his head. He would not answer. Bradine was left to wonder as she rode home with a lighter heart if her husband had, once upon a time, gained all the wisdom of the world from a salmon and fought giants on the distant shores of Britain. The end. Hello, and welcome back to Creepy Classics, the podcast retelling ancient, medieval, and early modern ghost stories. I'm Ed Harrisson. We have new episodes every month. We're back to monthly now, just about. I'm just about squeezing this into February, I think. If you can't get enough, I've also got a Patreon page now, and patrons get one extra ghost story in written form, in PDF format, every month. These follow the same format as the main podcast, but the stories come from the 19th and 20th centuries instead of the ancient, medieval, and early modern periods. They will eventually be collected together into books like some of the podcast stories have, but patrons will get them years in advance. Possibly they'll stay exclusive to Patreon, depending what I end up putting in the collections. There are also 3 books out collecting stories from this podcast, and each one includes one story that is exclusive to the book. They are called Creepy Classics, Ghost Stories from Ancient Rome, Ghost Stories from Ancient Greece, and Haunting Tales for Winter. And they're available from Kobo, Barnes & Noble, Apple, Fable, Amazon, all the usual places. I wanted to do a Celtic story. I'm working my way through some medieval stories in preparation for the next book collection. So this story will be in the next book collection, which is going to be medieval ghost stories. And I went looking for some Celtic ghost stories, and this is an Irish story, which I came across and decided I wanted to cover. I did not think through the fact when I chose an Irish story that this is a podcast, which means I have to say the words. I am learning Irish on Duolingo at the minute because I am Irish. I'm an Irish citizen. So I've been trying to learn the language, but I have not got very far. I'm much better at pronouncing Welsh and even Scottish than I am Irish. So I've done my absolute best with the pronunciation. In a couple of cases, I've kind of fiddled with the names to make them easier to pronounce for me. I have kind of tried to pronounce things as best I can. I'm sure I haven't got it quite right. I could, in theory, have done an Irish accent. This story is set not far from where my mum grew up. The setting, and this was pure luck when I went looking for Celtic ghost stories, that I found one set really close to a place I know very well. The story is set near Antrim, in County Antrim, and my mum grew up in Bangor, County Down. So I know the landscape very, very well, which was great and was a real advantage in kind of writing the story, though I did have to check the exact views from Antrim as opposed to from Bangor. I could have tried to tell the story in an Irish accent. I can, in theory, do either type of Irish accent, either a kind of generic Republic of Ireland accent, or I could do a County Down accent. It would definitely come out sort of somewhere between Bangor and Belfast, a little bit of a Belfast edge to it. It's a fairly, it's very Scottish sounding accent. My mum has frequently been mistaken for Scottish. And sometimes I hear accents from the west of Scotland and think for a minute that they're Irish. Belfast is a bit more recognisably Irish. So I could imitate that type of accent, which would even fit the area and everything. But I just thought, you know what, I would need like more time to practice and actually get it right. Even my own family's accent, if I just try and do it off the cuff, I think that could come out a bit wrong, and I don't want to try and do an accent that ends up coming out just sounding awful, especially if it's my own family's accent. Like, that makes it even worse if it comes out really bad. So I stuck to just using my own accent, but just trying to pronounce the Irish words as close as I could get to something in the general area of how they're supposed to be pronounced. I'm definitely very shaky on the pronunciation of the language and on the names. So Irish people who know Irish, please forgive me. I am working on it. The story is from a text called Lebor or Lebor. Again, not quite sure of the pronunciation. Lebor book. hUidre, the Book of the Dun Cow. This is the oldest extant manuscript in the Irish language. It was written somewhere around the 11th or 12th century, and the main story is set around the 7th century. And both of those are Christian periods. Christianity came to Ireland quite early. Christianity in southern Britain comes and goes in this period, depending on kind of migrations and invasions. It comes to what is now Scotland a little bit later, but it comes to Ireland kind of around the late Roman period, around the time towards where the Romans are about to leave southern Britain. So Mongán's period is Christian, and so is the period of the writer. But interestingly, it's still referred to the seasons from Samhain to Beltane, so it's clear that the old feasts were still known and potentially still being celebrated by those names, because it's Mongán who's celebrating Samhain and Beltane, who is earlier than the text is written, but still Christian. He's not meant to be a pagan king. So presumably the festivals were still being celebrated under those names, in a Christianized form, one would assume. The story of Fionn and Carta and Forgoll is set around the 3rd century, so that one is pre-Christian. Christianity exists in the 3rd century, but has not made it to Ireland at that point. That is during the period the Romans are occupying southern Britain. Roughly modern England and Wales is occupied by Romans in the 3rd century, but not what is now Scotland, which was at the time inhabited by Picts, or at least not most of it, and not Ireland. Romans never went to Ireland. Mongán has at least 3 wives associated with him. The wife in this text only seems to appear in this story, and I did change her name. I could not find any guidance online on how to pronounce the name I could see written down in the text, and it doesn't seem to be attested anywhere else. It's spelled Breothigirnd, which I think would be something along the lines of Briga. Might be Briga. But I wasn't sure. I couldn't find any information on it. So I just went looking for similar names instead, rather than try and pronounce it and get it wrong. And after looking at a few options, I ended up landing on Bridin, spelled Bridin, which is a diminutive of Bridget. And I think the Bridin with that kind of DG sound would be the Ulster pronunciation. But again, I could be wrong. And I'm relying on online sources for things like pronunciation, and they can be a bit dodgy, so... Bridin is a diminutive of Bridget, which is the name of one of the most important Christian saints in Ireland, who's also probably, her story has been conflated with a pre-Christian Celtic goddess, and her festival, the 1st of February, is the first day of spring. Now, this is not that person. I didn't want to imply that this woman was Bridget the saint, but I think Briga, or whatever her name is probably related to Bridget as a name. So I went with Bridin, or Bridin, which is a diminutive of Bridget and means little Bridget, or little Bridget. And most importantly was something I felt I could at least have a decent stab at pronouncing. Cumals were a bit like units of currency in medieval Ireland, and they also relate to people's honour price. If you murder or assault somebody, you have to pay them, or possibly their relative, depending on the crime and their status. You would have to pay them so many cumals in compensation. So they're a little bit like a kind of a unit of currency. 1 cumal was 3 milk cows, or 3 ounces of silver, or it was a certain number of slave women, but I couldn't quite find reliable information on how many exactly. Spears that you take the head off and throw were actually new to me, because I teach Greek and Roman history, and I am used to describing to my students hoplite warfare, which involves a very big spear that you stab people with. You try and poke it over the tops of the shields to stab them, which is a very different type of weapon. So I had to look up what was going on with the spear shaft and the spearhead. The River Alaba is the Larne. I did anglicise the Boyne, partly so that I could pronounce it, and partly because the Boyne is extremely famous. The Alaba is the Larne. The text says that the Fiona had been in Britain and came back by the Alaba, so I have assumed that they are coming from Scotland. Also, that is the ferry route we used to take when I was little. Whenever we visited my grandparents when I was a kid, we would take the ferry from Stranraer to Larne. So I had to include a reference to travelling from Scotland to Larne just for my own sake. The key idea in the story is actually more reincarnation than ghosts exactly. It is implying that Mongán is a reincarnation, or Fionn MacCool reborn. I apologise, I keep saying Mac, and it should be Muck, I think. In Irish pronunciation, it's more like Fionn MacCool rather than MacCool. And because I've written it down with what I think is the Irish spelling, M-A-C, my brain sees that and pronounces the A. Like I say, I'm really better at Scottish than Irish. So I do apologise. I know it should be Fionn MacCool, not MacCool. Anyway, he is the hero of the Fenian cycle of Irish legends, along with his warrior band, the Fiona. And a mythic cycle is something that you get in different bodies of mythology and legend. It's a bunch of stories from different texts, from different authors, from different times, that all relate to the same kind of general overriding story. So, for example, one of the best known cycles of mythology from Greek mythology is the Trojan War. And there's a whole bunch of stories relating to how it starts and things that happen in the war and what happens after the war and who dies and so on and so forth. And no individual text will tell the story of the whole thing. They'll choose a bit of it and tell the story of that. So Fionn is the focus of this Fenian cycle of Irish legends. And there's a lot of variation. Again, this is true of all bodies of mythology and legend. There isn't usually a kind of definitive version. There's lots of different versions. And Fionn is very different in different stories. In some stories and in some folklore, he seems to be a giant. So one of the folk tales about the formation of Loch Ness, which is the huge lake in the middle of Northern Ireland, is that he's a giant who takes a bunch of land and throws it at a giant in Scotland, but it falls into the middle of the sea and becomes the Isle of Man. And then the whole is Loch Ness. There's other folk tales about the formation of Loch Ness, but in that one, Fionn is a giant. Also, he builds the Giant's Causeway to go over to Scotland, and it leads to Fingal's Cave. Fingal was a name given to Fionn by 18th or 19th century writers in Scotland, which is kind of similar to the Giant's Causeway in terms of the rock formations. But in other stories, he seems to be a human. He's the leader of a band of warriors, but he seems perfectly human in some of the stories. There's a lot of different and contradictory versions. So what I've done is just choose the versions that best fit the story I'm trying to tell. So obviously my Fionn is not a giant. He is also still alive when Fáth hUidre is killed, which in other versions he's not. He's already dead. There's much more elaborate versions of the story of Gráinne, who runs off with one of the Fiona. I didn't include any of that. I was going with a specific poem about Gráinne, which involves Carta mac Ronald, because he's the other character in this story. So I was going with a different version of that, and so on. It also kind of helped my story anyway, because the whole point is an argument about the details of the life of Fionn, so it kind of made sense. And the story is implying that Mongán is this kind of reincarnation, as it were, of Fionn. In other versions of the story, he's sleeping somewhere in a cave, and he will wake up if enemies ever threaten Ireland, just like King Arthur. And just like King Arthur, I think one could make an argument for, wouldn't he have come back by now if that was the case? But anyway. The story also includes several references to the archaeology of Ireland, like Britain, the island of Great Britain, and like Brittany, the peninsula in northwestern France. Ireland is absolutely covered in standing stones, stone circles, and Neolithic dolmens and portal tombs, which are underground but have megalithic stones at the entrance, and other Neolithic and Bronze Age sites. There are about 1,300 stone circles in Britain and Ireland. They are absolutely everywhere. I'm going to do a YouTube video on them that I've been putting together over the past couple months at this point. They're very interesting. And these sites continue to be used for generations. So they're built, some in the Neolithic period. That's before the Celts even made it to France, Britain and Ireland, or at least to Britain and Ireland. Some are built in the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. There's an enormous amount of debate about when the Celts actually reached Britain and Ireland, and who was there before them, and whether the Beaker people who were there in the Bronze Age are Celts or not. And it's a whole thing. But anyway, these stone circles are built through the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods. And then they continue to be used even after that. So the Celtic Druids used them for religious practices. According to the Greek writer Strabo, they used them for human sacrifice. The Druids do appear to have practiced human sacrifice. There is a pretty decent amount of textual and archaeological evidence for that. They probably didn't only use them for human sacrifice. But certainly the Druids almost certainly did use the stone circles. They're right there. Druid temples, as it were groves of trees, and particularly sacred trees like oak. Mistletoe is not a tree, it's a parasite, but oak and mistletoe and that kind of thing. So a lot of druidic religious practices happened in woods, in groves, but they do also seem to have used the ancient temples, which were already ancient when they got there. Medieval Irish kings were also inaugurated at Neolithic or Bronze Age sites. So again, they're reusing these sites that are just there for the use. Ring forts would have been a little bit more up to date for the medieval period. They were built throughout the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and into the early medieval period. And the setting for this story is a real ring fort, Rathmore, near Antrim in Northern Ireland, near the town of Antrim. And the text accurately reflects the real site. It mentions the rampart of the fortress on the south side, which is indeed where the main rampart of the ring fort outside of Antrim is. That particular ring fort is preserved primarily in the kind of earthworks, but there are ring forts in other parts of Ireland where you can see a bit more of the actual stonework that they were built of. Caillte mentions in the text an inscription in Ogham, which is the alphabet of ancient Irish and some Pictish. So by the time we get texts written in Old Irish, they are written with Latin script. But pre St. Patrick and Christianity, the script for Irish was Ogham, and that's the script that the inscription is meant to be in. Forgoll the poet is a Fili. Again, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. These were very high status figures in Irish society, medieval Irish society. They were part poet, part Christianized druid, and part prophet or seer. They've clearly taken on some of the functions of druids, and it's in a Christianized form, but you can see that the old status of druid has kind of been transferred to these poets. So yes, they tell stories and poetry. They're kind of the keepers of the oral folklore and history, but they also function as seers, prophets, and they have these kind of magical powers. So there's a lot of threatening to satirize people. I used all three words satire, curse, and spell in the story to get across what it is. The text just says satire, but if you just translate that into English as satire, it sounds really weird. It says, I will satirize your father. And he's like, oh no, I'm going to give you all my land and my wife. Sounds extreme. Basically, it means a few different things. So satire could be similar to the English meaning, spreading misinformation about somebody, making fun of them in a way that is damaging to them, that kind of thing. I mean, satire shouldn't be misinformation, but that kind of speech that is harmful to somebody is one of the things that can be meant by satire in Old Irish, but it also can function as a curse or a magic spell that's designed to hurt somebody, which I guess is just another way of saying a curse. That word is used for curses as well. In the book Understanding Celtic Religion, it says that dangerous words can be identified as satire, or congain comail, I'm probably not pronouncing that right, magical wounding, and corganecht, sorcery in Old Irish, or as a tua, a charm, and glam diken, which is a lethal type of satire. So you can see there how much satire overlaps with curses. There's an element of magic along with the poetry and the literature, which again probably reflects druids. Druids didn't write anything down, unfortunately, which is a problem when you're an historian trying to study them. But presumably they did kind of keep the history and literature of their people in an oral way and transmit it orally. If you would like to read more, I had to obviously do a lot of looking up for this one because this is not my specialist area. The text is from The Celtic Heroic Age, Literary Sources for Ancient Celtic Europe and Early Ireland and Wales by John T. Koch with John Carney. I also used A History of Ireland in 250 Episodes by Jonathan Bardon, Stations of the Sun by Ronald Hutton, and Understanding Celtic Religion by J.Borsje. I can't pronounce that name either. It's a different language though, not Irish. I have to say, I used a lot of Wikipedia on this one. I try, to use Wikipedia as a starting point and then go and find my own sources. That is obviously the thing that you do. I did end up using a lot of Wikipedia just because I'm not super familiar with Irish myth and legend. It's not like when I do Greek and Roman stuff and I know the Greek and Roman myths and legends and I don't have to look up who Paris and Helen are or something. But I'm not familiar with Irish myth and legend. So I did make a lot of use of Wikipedia just to get a sense of who everybody was and kind of what their stories were and what's going on with them. And I also used a children's book I bought for my son called Favourite Irish Legends by Yvonne, Carroll, Fiona Waters and Felicity Trotman to kind of get a sense of some of the stories about Fiona. I bought that in the Ulster Folk Museum last time we visited my aunt, and that came in very handy too. I found a great website on the Rathmore ring fort, storymaps.artgis.com. I'll put a link in the description. I found another website at dill.ie on the Tugan. The word comes from the Latin toga, and that's the feathered cloak or cloak made of bird skins that the poets wore. I watched a video from Cosmic Viking on YouTube on Irish archaeology, which is great for visualising some of the sites, and I watched another video on ring forts as well. I had a look at the thanes.blogspot.com on the spearheads, because those were new to me, and irishfolklore.wordpress.com on the Brehon laws. And if you have access to JSTOR, I also had a look at an article by Neil MacLeod, Assault and Attempted Murder in Brehon Law from Irish Jurist, and an article by R.G. Berry on the royal residence of Rathmore of Moylin, with notes on other early earthworks in Ulster from the Ulster Journal of Archaeology. That one was from 1898, so it's a smidge out of date, but in my defence, I don't think the archaeology has changed all that much. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you would like to support the podcast, then please do consider buying one of the books or supporting me on Patreon. As I say, this story will appear in my next book, Medieval Ghost Stories, alongside Vikings, late Romans, Robin Hood, Arthurian legend, and all sorts of exciting things. So that should hopefully be out about the end of April, so keep an eye out for that. And next month will be another medieval story because I am building up to the same collection. So until then, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Creepy Classics is written and performed by J.Harrisson, music composed and performed by Ed Harrisson, and it was produced by J.Harrisson.